Hello and welcome, and in this video we're going to be looking at rhyme and style of poetry. So the rhyme and style of a poem is something that is particularly unique quite often to a particular poet or an era in which a poem has been written in. And there are ideas which are linked together. So the style of poetry is something that is quite often deliberately chosen or done. It is done in such a way where the poem has a particular unique feel to it, and often poets will have their own sort of signature style to them. So the way that they write is fairly unique to them. Now, you'll be mainly looking for things like structural patterns. You'll also be looking at things like rhythm, but you'll also be looking at sort of language techniques and ideas such as imagery, emotion, tone, other things like that as well. And they are in part what makes up the rhythm or the style of a particular poem. So when you have a look at it, try and see that not only can you find any patterns in it, but what sort of rhyming structure is there? What sort of structure to the language is there? How does it sort of sound in your head while you're reading it? Because if you can pick certain things up as you're reading it in your head, and usually it's punctuated in such a way, I'll often use a lot of dashes and a lot of commas and colons and semicolons as a way of breaking up the poem so it matches the style or the rhythm that an author in particular or a poet particularly wants you to be reading it as you're going through it in your head. So let's just start with rhyme. Now, rhyme is something that you would have done a lot of in poetry, particularly when you're doing poetry in your junior years. And yes, it's about connecting a couple of words together, things like limericks and rhymes and all those sorts of things. But when you're looking at it critically in a poem, even if you're looking at a limerick critically, it is a little bit different when you are looking at it because you are mainly doing it in order to detect a pattern or an effect, to gauge what effect it has. So if I was to read this one out, what sort of effect do you think it has? Birds of a feather lark, bane of a withered park, murder of crows at dark. Alright, so immediately you're sort of thinking along the lines of this might sound like a song, and it has that lyrical quality. So like a song does. If you'll put this to music, it could easily be a song in some way. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be a very good song, but what it does is it has an effect that when a person reads it, when a person goes through each line, and just reads it in their head or even reads it out loud, then it has that effect of appearing like a song or even having a sing-song quality, which particularly if you have got a very dark poem like this one might be, and you're singing it in a very, very happy sort of tune, it has this immediate sort of weird effect on you that why am I singing a happy tune about something that's very murderous and very dark? So it's one of those things that poets like to use. They use it often to create tricks, but often they just do it so whatever they are writing sounds better. And it's something that you can analyze and talk about in such a way to say that there's a particular pattern, and that rhyme creates an effect that it makes you feel like you're reading something that's lyrical or song-like. So let's have a look at the second part of that, of rhyme, which is couplets. Now, couplets are basically groupings. So if you have a look at the example to the right here, you've got a poem which has actually been written like a song. When the sunset paints the sky, see the magpies flying by. All right, now those two lines there are grouped together. Obviously you've got the musical notes there underneath, and they are obviously if you're performing this on a piano or on a musical instrument. But couplets are the same things which are used in music to group rhymes together, and they're often used in poetry for the exact same purpose, to essentially group two rhyming words together. Now what they do is essentially when you have those connections between different lines, you start to have a bit of a pattern emerging, should I say. They are sentences that linked, and often they are with rhyming words, but that's not necessarily the case. It can be just two words with similar sets of descriptions or ideas. So it might be a bit of repetition, so it might just be two lines that are repeated, not necessarily rhyming, but have been written in much the same way, and those two are grouped together as well. So by breaking them down into couplets, you can actually start to break down the poem even more than just looking at lines or looking at stanzas. You'll be actually going much deeper into it and finding out all the different aspects of the poet's style, which is making basically the poem that they are reading come off the page when you're supposed to be reading it. I know that's a bit of a statement which not many of you will probably be that familiar with, or at least, I mean, most people hate poetry, so when they're reading it, they're not exactly picking or looking to pick up those ideas. But when you are looking at a poem, you can still identify where two particular groups of words rhyme or basically form a pattern. So let's have a look at these sort of patterns. And it's very similar. If you're a kind of person who does music or plays a musical instrument, this becomes a little bit more natural to you, because they are very similar to the way that a note will be grouped in music, or the way that a particular rhythm has been set up. So each rhyme, if you're doing something like if you play the guitar and there's a particular riff, then it's a pattern of music that often repeats itself over and over again. So it's very, very similar to how a poem is constructed. It often repeats a particular rhythm, and it often goes back on itself over and over and over again. So let's look at an example. You might describe their grouping by just a group of letters. So friend, A, B for boom. Then you got A for end, so friend and end rhyme. And then we've got loom and boom. So we've got a pattern of A's and we've got a pattern of B's. And so what we've got in the end there is an A-B rhyming pattern. So obviously all these words there would be the rhyming words. They would be lines contained within the verses or the lines of the poem. And through each one, we get basically a unique thing which joins the other thing together. Now that helps to chain basically the ideas, but also the sounds that each poem is generating together. And what effect that creates is essentially, it's one of those things that gets you to continue reading it. Now, it's not necessarily an effect just to do that, but what it does is it helps to set up a quality where different ideas might be linked together just purely through rhyme. And by doing that, you actually be able to start layering different ideas on top of it. And through your interpretation of the language techniques, particularly in those ones that rhyme, or even just in the way that the subject matter and the content is arranged, you're able to then create another avenue of discussion for when you're building your argument about the poem that you're discussing. So, okay, what other styles of poetry are there? Well, obviously we're not talking about groupings of genres as a particular definite term. So you might have come across words like narrative, speculative, lyrical, satirical, all those things. Now, they're not necessarily a static term. As I said, a narrative poem can easily be satirical. It really depends on the kind of poet and what grouping that a lot of other people would consider that poet to be in. Now, if you're a person who doesn't do poetry that often, and I'm guessing that's probably most of you, then it's probably a good idea just to see what other people who look at poetry more seriously and look at poetry more often put these poems into. So you get a sort of an idea for the kinds of different poetry that's out there. And it makes it easier for you to discuss a particular poem in context, and often you'll be asked to discuss a poem in its context. So who wrote it, where did they come from, what was going on at the time in their lives. Not necessarily is that important to why it was written. That's not really why you're looking at, but you'll be looking at the sort of the avenue or the time in which it was written. Of course, it may also be grouped by the era, so, or even the subject matter. So Romanticist, Elizabethan, those poems would actually fall in particular eras. So Elizabethan would be roughly about Shakespeare's time, or just after Shakespeare. Romanticist is sort of late 19th century. So when you come across all these different styles, what you've got is poems being written by a group of people in a number of different ways in a particular era. Just like you would have metaphysical or Gothic, for instance, as being different subject matter, which means that a metaphysical poem, for instance, is often about religion in the church, and was a style particularly of Elizabethan and Jacobean poets, which they would express their love of God or religion. And just the same as Gothic poetry, again, has that sort of that very dark and meditative quality, which you would normally associate with Goth, basically. And even all those other styles the subject matter and the groupings are not necessarily a static thing. You can blend those two things together again, but it gives you a bit of a background and gives you a bit of an idea of some things you can discuss about that poem, and then you can also link it to why you believe that poem falls in that particular category. So how do I tell? How do I find which thing my poem that I'm reading fits into? Well, very simply, do research. Find out a bit about your poem that you've got in class. Now, it only takes 5 minutes on Google. If you type in the type of poem, you'll usually get a checklist of all the different things that your poem falls into the category of. And if you write some of those down and just keep those in the back of your mind, it's very, very easy to do, and it saves you a lot of time, particularly when you're trying to analyze it and you're trying to work out how to do it. So if you've got a checklist of some very simple ways of describing the poem that you're studying, not only does it make it easier to interpret in terms of the ideas and the meaning and all those things, but you'll have essentially in the back of your mind a number of different ideas on context and also the ideas on style as well, which you can then use as a way of building up your discussion. You may also think that understanding every word that you read in a poem is important. It's not. And I come across this with students quite often who get frustrated by poetry and think that because they don't understand it, that they can't talk about it. Now, poetry is often quite difficult to understand. Now, when you actually read a poem and you've got this line that's very obscure, and a lot of poets deliberately put obscure lines into the poetry, even ones that historians and poetry critics find difficult to decipher because they really don't know where the poet has come from in writing it. In either case, you have to look for something like common ground. You have to look for things that make that style of poetry similar to others. And the important thing is that when you have a look at a particular poem, what you're essentially doing is you are interpreting it in your own way. So if you see a couple of lines together and you think it means sadness, then you would write about it and you explain why those lines you believe, in your opinion, equal sadness. And the only time you can't do that is A, you haven't used evidence, or B, if it doesn't match the rest of the poem. So if the rest of the poem is quite happy, and the lines that you have used to describe sadness are sort of a little bit inconclusive, you can't really make that statement for sure, particularly when you read the rest of the poem, then it's a point that you really can't use. Now, the other thing that you may come across is ye old British. So, language which is completely foreign to you. It doesn't even seem like it's been written in English. And this is often something you would apply to older eras of poetry, and quite often students in even all years of high school, in fact, have to look at an old style English poem, which might be written like Donne's Deaf Be Not Proud, for instance. As in, die not, poor deaf, nor yet canst thou kill me. Now, you might think that this guy's a rather poor speller, but that's the way that language was written at a particular time. And if you translate it, and this is fairly easy to do, particularly once you get a bit of practice at it, die not, poor deaf, nor yet can you kill me. So, die not because you can't kill me yet. Easy. You translate it for meaning, but you use the original for your quotes. Now, what I mean by that is when you come across a poem like that and it's written that particular way and you're going, I don't understand a word of that, it's all gibberish. Translate it. Particularly, there's a lot of American guides on the internet out there which already translate it for you into proper American English, which makes it very easy to do. But when you translate it and you have an idea of what it means and you can discuss it and talk about it, you'll be using as evidence the original text. So you'll be using the top one. The idea of, the line which is in Donne's original text rather than what you would interpret it as. Now that's just to make sure that you're keeping it true to the original text and not using someone's translation, which may change or alter the meaning of it slightly. And you don't want to be using that sort of interpretation because obviously you don't want to seem like you're making it up. And that's why you need to actually use the original. However, you're more than welcome to use a paraphrase version or a version that's in your own words as a way of being able to think about the sorts of meaning that poem has and then just quickly translate it back when you're writing it properly in an exam. And really that's all the essence, in essence, what you need to know about style and also rhyme in poetry. Really, it's just a matter of having a look very closely, trying to identify what patterns you can find, and then if you are in doubt, to go and do a bit of research, like you should be doing for all your texts anyway. Every text you read, you should be doing a little bit of research on it, even if it's a bit quick half an hour of just reading up on it, whether it's on Wikipedia, whether or not it's on, if it's a film, if you're looking on IMDb, if it's either a book appreciation society website, book club, whatever it is. It will give you some ideas which will then be useful to you when you go off and explore them and actually go a little bit deeper into them. This doesn't require huge effort. This requires just a very small moment of your time, and it will save you a lot of time, particularly when you're trying to analyze it later and you're getting stuck and frustrated and wanting to throw the thing out the window. Because let's face it, even I sometimes, and a lot of other teachers feel the same way, would like to throw poetry out the window sometimes because it's really complex and infuriating and frustrating, especially it is to teach. But when you have a look at it, and when you study poetry in school, the thing to remember is that it is something which is really up to your own interpretation, provided that you use evidence and language and that you do a little bit of research to see what other people think. Now, you don't necessarily take their ideas as fact, but you use it as something that which can inform your ideas as well. But otherwise, that's about all we have for this. So until next time, I'll see you later.